One of the things you told me about is
It's
what
crazy.
you
It's
call
insane.
magic money computers at the Treasuries. So tell us about it, because I never heard of that until you brought that up.
Okay, so you may think that that the government computers like all talk to each other, they synchronize, they add up what funds are going somewhere, and it's coherent. That the numbers, for example, that you're presented as a senator, are actually the real numbers.
One would think.
One would think. They're not.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, they're not totally wrong, but they're probably off by 5% or 10% in some cases. So I call a magic money computer any computer which can just make money out of thin air. That's magic money.
So how does that work?
It just issues payments.
And you said there's something like 11 of these computers at Treasury that are sending out trillions in payments?
They're mostly at Treasury. Some are, but there's some at HHS, there's one or two at State, there's some at DOD. I think we found now 14 magic money computers.
14, okay.
They just send money out of nothing.
One of the last questions I wanted to ask you is about Trump's tariffs, because I kind of alluded to it before, but he floated the idea of abolishing the income tax and replacing with super high tariffs, and now he's already imposing high tariffs on everybody. In Canada, we've been hit by his tariffs. So I'm curious what you think about his tax policy and his tariff policy, because that's what's on everybody's mind right now.
In economics is the opposite of religion. It's better to receive than to give, And I guess it's too hard for them. I'd never send one of them to go shopping for me, that's for sure. They'll come back from the grocery store saying, I'm not going to that store again. They weren't charging enough. Go to another store. It's like, who are these people? Maybe they've never gone shopping. I don't know. We should be holding a ticker tape parade, on Fifth Avenue for China for having supported our standard of living for the last 20, 30 years, sending us free things and not wanting anything in return except the bank statement saying that they did it. And, without them, we wouldn't have our standard of living. It would be substantially lower. And instead, he's trying to end it, kill the goose that's laying the golden egg. And they're fighting it. They want to keep doing it. The whole thing's absurd, but that's what's going on. And it's real. And it's the same people who can make a cell phone can't understand something as simple as that. What are we punishing Canada for? Not charging us enough for lumber. What kind of crime is that? We should be rewarding you for that. Giving you some kind of special tourism rights when you come to the United States, thanking you for selling us things at low prices. That's a good thing for us. We don't. President Trump put tariffs on Canada because you weren't charging us enough. And then President Biden, doubled down, added to the tariffs because you still weren't charging us enough. These people it's madness, and I don't know what else to tell you.
You're listening to One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra content.
We think that ideology is something blurring, confusing our straight view. Ideology should be glasses which distort our view. And the critique of ideology should be the opposite. You take off the glasses so that you can finally see the way things really are.
When you talk about a revolution, most people think violence, without realizing that the real content of any kind of revolutionary thrust lies in the principles and the goals that you're striving for, not in the way you reach them.
Philosophers call someone a relativist, by which they mean it's a person that holds that any view is as good as any other view. My simple response to that is this: no one holds that view. No one believes that every view is as good as every other view.
And for newcomers who haven't already been following MMT for a while, I would like you to give a kind of brief explanation about what MMT is and perhaps maybe how you arrived at it, because one of my favorite things is in soft currency economics when you talk about your sort of epiphany in Italy.
Yeah. The important thing to understand that everybody who works in the Federal Reserve knows and has always known is that the money to pay taxes and the money to buy government bonds comes from the government through its agent, who at the moment is the Federal Reserve Bank. They actually have to spend first before there's money out there in the economy to pay their taxes. But when you talk to anybody outside the Federal Reserve, kind of backwards, and policy is being driven by this backwards thinking.
Yeah. Well, I think a primer for the general audience is sort of like the MMT story about how money is created, like from a kind of technical but more sort of overview, because I think it's not at this point that controversial to say that you don't need to balance the budget and that you can run deficits. Like that's pretty accepted. But where people tend to really find MMT mind blowing or just unbelievable is the idea that taxes don't fund government spending. And that is, I think, the interesting contribution of MMT. And also, I do also want to get you to address like what makes MMT unique as a theory, because some people who don't want to learn this stuff dismiss it as just like repackaged Keynesianism.
Does the government actually need your tax dollars? No, they come from government. So number one, the government puts a tax requirement on it. Number two, you go to work, let's say, for the government. Keep it simple. They will pay you first before they've collected any tax. They will pay you. And now you have money to pay the tax to them. Okay. And that's the payment of taxing comes after they've spent the money. That's why it's called a tax return. You're returning the dollars to the government. That's why it's called revenue, because revenue means return in Latin or one of those languages. You go back to the Bible. It says, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's. They all know the coins come from Caesar. And when you pay your taxes, you're returning those coins to where they came from. Okay, this is not something new. This has been known for thousands of years. It's only been forgotten recently in the last 200 or 300 years. And it's just been destroying public policy.
That's really fascinating because people tend to point the opposite. They tend to say, well, throughout history, there's been tons of empires that have fallen because they ran out of money or because of inflation. And they think that it's only like the only way that, I guess you could say, soft currency economics is plausible at all is due to the fact that we're off the gold standard. And I guess that's partially true, but like even David Graeber seems to show how like money was a unit of account without like a hard commodity value prior to it becoming like commodity value. It was just like a unit of account. So like the order is opposite.
And so the modern monetary theory isn't a prescription for a specific, policy agenda or anything like that. It's a description. It's called a lens to look at what's going on, describe it, and understand it. So if I look at Hong Kong today, that's a fixed exchange rate convertible to dollars. Bulgaria is convertible into euro. We can talk about the United States in 1930 on the gold standard. I can explain that. We can talk about right now where the US dollar is not convertible into any foreign currency. So it's not limited to any one policy agenda. It's a entirely general theory that covers all monetary operations.
And that's precisely one of the things I want to inquire about is the differences between other MMT theorists regarding the prescriptions. Because like that is something I find interesting. I had Bill Mitchell on recently who does see a role for very high taxes, but not to fund government spending, but rather to reduce inequality. I have heard you talk before about sort of more libertarian approach, but I do want to hear it from you in terms of your tax proposals. The first thing there is to address the elephant in the room always is inflation. People tend to think, well, okay, still, even if the government doesn't have to earn money, revenue to spend, inflation's a constraint. Of course, you say that. Now, what makes the MMT theory of inflation that you talk about in soft currency economics and elsewhere what does it add to the economic discourse that the previous like Keynesian theories, for example, missed?
They miss the first thing I told you, which was the funds to pay taxes come from the government. Okay. And if you don't understand that, you don't understand the source of the price level. You do not understand inflation. Okay. And so why is that? The government put a tax on your house. Okay. And then it's denominated in dollars, let's say $10,000. You don't even know what a dollar is. Let's say it was George Washington. The economy doesn't know what $10,000 is. All they know is they can only get it from the government. Okay. That puts the government in a position where it has to let the economy know what it has to do to get the money from the government. It's the single supplier. This is microeconomics 101. When there's a single supplier, they have to set the price. It's not a market. The market is when you have multiple suppliers competing, but not one single supplier. When you take microeconomics, they tell you about how a monopoly works. It's the easiest thing to learn. There's one guy who's got what you want, and you have to pay whatever he wants, or else he doesn't have to sell it. So he's the price setter. Okay. The next thing they teach you is about if you have a small number of suppliers called oligopoly. And they used to use say there's 3 or 4 car companies, and how does that work? How do they wind up setting price for 3 or 400? That's more complicated. That might take 4 or 5 hours, maybe a whole day. Okay. The last one is competition. You have, in theory, infinite buyers, infinite sellers competing, market prices are determined. And how does that work? Okay, that takes the rest of your life. It takes advanced mathematics, it takes all kinds of things to decode those markets to figure out how prices are determined in those markets. The whole supply and demand comes from having multiple buyers, multiple sellers. How do they all interact in the marketplace? Okay. The good news for the currency is the dollar. It's the first one. It's the easy one. There's a single supplier. So if the government says to earn dollars, you have to serve in the army and pay and get $40,000 a year, the economy has no choice. Either somebody will serve in the army or people are going to lose their homes because there's no other way to get the money to pay the tax. How does that translate into what a barber can charge for a haircut or what lumber is going to cost to build a house or anything else? So if everything else kind of keys off of that, all right? If the government said, we're going to pay $20,000 to be a soldier, now we all have to figure out what that means. And that means everything else is going to cost half as much. The money's twice as valuable. And so the money's more valuable because the government's making it harder to get. The more the government pays for the same thing, the easier that money is to get. If the government said we'll pay $1 million a month for a soldier, that money is very easy to get. The Japanese government tells us what people have to do to get yen. The U.S. government tells us what we have to do to get dollars. The market can then figure out the exchange rate based on that. And it will price everything in all these different currencies where they're getting their information about, the core value of these currencies from what these other governments pay when they spend. I can give you another example if you want. So my wife and I were on a tour of Pompeii, just outside of Rome. And we jumped on this tour while we were walking around, and the guide got to the point where he showed us the coins that he found in Pompeii. They were just regular metal coins. They weren't gold or anything like that. And he said Pompeii was a very nice place to live because the government would collect these coins for taxes, and then they would pay people to do public services like sanitation and public safety. So I'm a bit of a troublemaker. I said to him, well, in Pompeii, the government had to pay the people first before they could collect the coins for tax. He says, no. That's not how it works. They collect tax and then they pay the people. Everybody knows that. And I said, well, where did the coins come from? And he said, well, the government made them. So I said, well, how did anybody get a coin to pay the tax? And he says, well, they have to pay them first and then they collect the tax. I said, well, how else could it possibly work? He grabs his head like this and he goes, no. And he ran away from me and he wouldn't talk to me for the rest of the tour after they spent the month. They'd pay the people first and then they would collect the coins. So how did 20,000 of those coins get in the street? And they were found in what might have been somebody's pocket, but they were killed in the eruption. What might have been somebody's cash box for business, what might have been under somebody's mattress, right? Because it was all burned. How did they get there? Those are coins that they came from the government. We all know that. They spent more than they collected. People were willing to earn more coins in total they needed just to pay the tax. Why? Well, they wanted to have some coins in their pocket. They wanted to keep some coins under the mattress. The merchants wanted to be able to make change. There's all kinds of reasons people would earn more coin in government than the economy needed to pay the tax. Okay. And those were the public debt of Pompeii. The 20,000 coins in the street were the public debt. Those are the coins that the government had spent on people coming to work over time since the beginning, since when they started this thing, that were in excess of what was needed to pay taxes. And they would stay in the street indefinitely until someday somebody used them to pay taxes. Otherwise, there's not much else they can do. You could use them to buy something from somebody else, but then they're in his pocket. Okay, they're just going to move from one person to another, and the last they're used to pay taxes.
Yeah, that actually was the next question, which is that if taxes are not there to generate revenue that the government needs to spend, but rather to generate value for that currency or demand for it, rather to force people to kind of use it. And that leads to the implication that the government doesn't have that tax revenue cap on how much it can spend. And the obvious question people ask always is like, how would you prevent inflation from happening, assuming you're able to spend and the government is able to spend in this way without this monetary constraint?
Well, on day one, the government has no revenues. It's put a tax on everybody's house. Nobody paid anything in tax. People are wind up looking for work so they don't lose their house. The government starts the ball rolling by spending and hiring those people and getting the streets clean and having public safety established. After that, taxes can get paid. You have to understand the sequence, which is first there's a tax requirement for tax liability. Then you have people looking for work because of that requirement. And then the government hires them and then they get paid. And then the taxes get paid. Let's say Pompeii pays the police officers 10 coins a day. And a pizza maker has to decide whether he wants to earn 10 coins a day or sell pizzas for 1 coin each. Okay. If he can make 10 pizzas a day, he might decide, you know what? I can either make my 10 coins like pizzas, or I can be a police officer and make 10 coins. If he can get 2 coins for a pizza, now it's easy. I can make 20 coins selling pizzas. I don't want to be a police officer. Let's say he can only get half a coin for a pizza. Or let's say he has to sell 2 pizzas to get 1 coin. Now he might decide, I don't want to have to make 20 pizzas a day. It's too much work. I want to be a police officer. Okay. But if I could sell 1 pizza for 1 coin, I'm okay. And it's a whole marketplace of people who decide ultimately that, 1 pizza sells for 1 coin. You can make 10 pizzas a day. It's about the same as working as a policeman or a sanitation officer. So they're happy. And so you have an equilibrium will set in, and it won't necessarily be that price. There'll be some price where the population's indifferent between making pizzas and working for the government. And the dirtier the work, the more likely they'd be to make pizzas even at a lower price so they don't have to do the work. And the more that the sanitation workers' money can buy because it's harder to get. It's really dirty work. If it's easy work, good working conditions, it might go the other way. Okay, so what happens if the government doubles the pay of the policeman? Instead of 10 coins a day, they pay him 20 coins a day. Okay, now they've made the money a lot easier to get. Now the same pizza maker, if he can still has to make, if he can go to work and earn 20 coins instead of selling his pizzas for 1 coin each, and where he has to make 20 of them, he's going to go to work as a police officer. He's not going to make pizzas. Price of pizzas are going to go up. And they'll go up to the same price they were before, where they were like 2 coins each. He can make his, 10 pizzas, make the same 20 coins he did before. And his indifference levels between making pizzas and being a police officer are about the same. If they make the money easy to get, then prices are up. You can't change that. That's fundamental to the economy. So that's the source of the price level and the source of inflation. Changes in what the government pays when it spends. And there are lots of case studies, particularly in South America, that trace all the great inflations down there in Latin America to indexation. Okay, when some price level went up, the government would give everybody more money. All right. Made it easier to get the money. It's more money for the same job. So the price level would go up again. We can trace the Argentine inflation of the last few years to the same thing, except they did it with interest rates. When they raised interest rates, the government's giving out free money to people who already have money. And they raised interest rates to like 50% rates.
Through the bonds, right? Just to clarify.
So now that's just free money coming from the government. It's all deficit spending. There was no tax to pay for it. So that's just caused prices to go up 50%. In the foreign exchange market, the peso went down 50% because they just added that money for doing nothing. And so what did they do? They said, well, inflation hasn't stopped, so let's raise rates to 100%. Now they've doubled the free money they're paying in interest. And so prices go up some more. They got up to 200% before the guy with the chainsaw came in, changed the policy and started cutting rates. They've cut rates down to 40% and the inflation's dropped to 40%. But it all comes down to a similar thing. It's the money that government's paying, what you have to do to get it is always the source of the price level.
Let's say you were a secretary of the Treasury. How would you advise, for example, Canada? Because Venezuela's problem is a little bit more straightforward with, the oil prices and stuff. But like, let's say Canada, we have our Treasury and bank don't seem to follow MMT at all. They believe interest rate hikes are the answer. Now, how would you advise reducing inflation?
Well, I actually did that. About 3 or 4 years ago, I met with Tiff Macklin, who's now the head of his Bank of Canada. He had me at a conference that he was holding in Canada, just north of Toronto somewhere, and with lots of central bankers and that such. And I went and explained how the interest rate was, the inflation rate was causing the inflation. And they answered back and forth. We had a very in-depth technical discussion about what we've talked about. And they all pretty much agreed with the channels I was talking about. There wasn't any major disagreement, probably went on for an hour or 2 hours. And, very amicable and very professional. And they were top analysts from the Bank of Canada, multiple PhDs in these things. And all my math checked out, the arithmetic, all the data checked out. He became chairman of the central bank 6 months later, maybe. And it was like it never happened. And he just went right on espousing the idea that they needed to raise rates to fight inflation. Like it never happened. So I don't know what happened during that period of time, but I know it did not change policy.
I find that strange because, of course, there was previous Federal Reserve Chairman of the United States who kind of admit certain things that MMT theorists have been saying, but then would go on to kind of regurgitate the same old dogmas. Now, could that be because the real purpose of the interest rate being to create the natural rate of unemployment, in other words, to just kind of have to give less bargaining power for working people?
So we went through that and how that natural rate was all sourced to fixed exchange rate policy. It had no application whatsoever to the floating exchange rate policy of Canada and the United States. It's like watching a different movie channel, and, watching a different movie and taking the information from one and applying it to the other. It doesn't work that way. So that was look. I knew Vince Reinhardt pretty well. He was at the Fed. He was a right-hand man for Greenspan for many years, and then Chairman Bernanke. He helped me write some of my speeches. Okay, we spoke the same language, and there's like no question about this. And what he would say is, look, the hardest part of his job was working with these people, these political appointees who did not understand monetary operations, and they did the best they could, and this is what we've got.
So why do they uphold the noble lie, or if we were going to call it that?
Keynes said it's better to fail conventionally than to succeed unconventionally. There's a lot to that. And they just stick to this because if they do it and it doesn't work, they can't be blamed for it. They're doing what textbooks say, what they've, were taught and not. And if they succeed unconventionally, they get criticized for it and lose their job, even though it works. That's just the nature of mankind.
So one rebuttal I noticed that comes from the libertarian von Mises type of people is that they always like to say that MMT is a Trojan horse for state control, because if one takes the assumption that the government is the monopoly price setter, then the solution to inflation would be setting prices. So I want to give you the chance to clarify just straightforwardly the ways in which the state should deal with inflation.
Yeah, the solution, first of all, the problem's always different, but they agree that the government set the price. They want the government to set the price of gold and then let everything else be relative to the price of gold. And we had that years ago. The price of gold was set at $35 an ounce. The government would buy or sell gold at $35 an ounce and conduct policy that was tight enough to make sure that there was enough gold, which eventually failed. But, for a while it worked. And under that scenario, everything they talk about is correct. There is a natural rate of interest where investment equals savings, which is defined as your gold supply, because they have their own set of definitions for that set of policy. And the natural rate of interest is the one where your gold supply, your reserves don't go up or down or they're neutral. The market doesn't take away gold or give you extra gold. It's stable, and a stable gold supply, by definition, is stable prices and zero inflation. So within that mathematical construct, they're absolutely correct. We still have the same situation where the government has to set a price. They're just not setting the price of gold. They have to set another price when they spend, because there's no other way for them to spend. The market can't do that. Okay, so if I'm the electric company, the market can't tell me what to charge for electricity because there's no substitute. I can't look and see where it's trading in the market because there's no other sellers of electricity. I have to say, all right, let's try 10 cents a kilowatt. If they say that's not good, we don't want the government, the city, to be setting the price of electricity. Well, we're talking about indisputable fact that there's a single supplier. You tell me how else you can do it when there's a single supplier. Well, we think the market should do it. Well, market means multiple suppliers that compete with each other. We don't have that. Well, the only thing he can say to that is, well, I don't like it, which is what Robert Murphy said, Professor Murphy, in my debate with him. That's still online. But halfway through, he said, well, everything, John Carney was a moderator, was a Breitbart now. He said, everything Mosler says is technically correct. He says, I just don't like it. And Carney looks at him and they go like, okay, this debate, I guess, is over. The Austrians have, quote, lost the debate because they agree everything I said is correct and that they are correct within their own context of exchange rates. But he doesn't like it. So they talked a little bit about he doesn't like government coercion with taxation. Right? Fine, but if you have another way to get people in the army, to get, the government to provision itself so it can have a list system, and he did. Okay, he kind of fumbled around for different ways for a while. The debate kind of ended on, look, these are the cards we're dealt. We want a public sector to do certain minimum things, which he agreed. We don't want no public sector because we have fallacies of composition, races to the bottom. We need a public sector. Let's say you go to a football game and you stand up. Now people can't see. So they all stand up. Okay, now everybody has to stand up and nobody sees any better. So what we do is we have collective action. You call it government, but it's collective action. The stadium or somebody makes a rule, you can only stand up for 10 or 15 seconds, then you have to sit down. And there aren't too many libertarians that say, no, let everybody stand up, and then you have to stand up the whole game or you can't see. And they all kind of agree that we're all better off if there's a rule that says you can only stand up, during a touchdown or a home run or whatever for 15 seconds, and then you have to sit down so everybody can sit. So that's called a fallacy of composition. One person stands up, he can see better. So we should all just stand up and we can all see better. No, we all stand up, we can't. We all see the same and we can't even sit down. So that's the role for government, is to control these fallacies of composition so that we can all watch the game. Right? And it happens with pollution way back, where you had no federal, it was up to the states to regulate all their air and water, clean air and clean water. So what you had is the states got in this race to the bottom with each other. Whoever allowed the most pollution got business to come to their state, and they needed the money. And so there was, finally the rivers in Ohio started catching fire. We wound up with federal regulation saying, okay, this doesn't work. It's got a race to the bottom, setting the states in competition with each other on this particular thing. We need federal regulation. So those are the areas at a minimum where you need federal regulation. Race to the bottom, fallacy of composition. You also need like a common defense. I don't think we want each state or each city to defend itself. And we all agree there's problems with the military. But I think most people would agree to have a military legal system. There are people who think we should privatize the legal system where you pay for your judges. There are people who think we already have that. Okay. It comes down to most people would rather not have a private legal system, private prisons, things like that. You just don't feel very good when you're being accused when you're on trial, knowing the judge is going to be providing free labor to the state if he can put you in jail and they can sell you labor, or they're in a position to kick back money to the judge, where we've had massive scandals on this to incarcerate people. So we see there are problems with certain areas, and we use collective actions. So, and Professor Murphy agreed with that, although we might have had different things where you might have thought more things could be private. I pretty much agreed with him on what could be private and what could not be private. They don't think there should be coercive taxation. Well, then you don't have the rest of it. They haven't connected those dots. Okay, and so Professor Murphy's a smart guy. He connects the dots. He understands what you have to do to get a minimum of cooperative action. And so we're not in disagreement, and I'm not in. I consider myself in that sense only, not politically with what these people do. I mean, I would never go to the meetings or anything. But the way I define the words libertarian, where government is there to prevent racism, to do these essential things where the market is likely to fail and do a much worse job. Other places, the market's more appropriate, And so I'll leave it at that. I've kind of rambled on here.
Well, no, that was very helpful. And the big question here is the tax policy as solution, because you have some disagreements with other MMTers, and some of the points that you, but as well as other MMTers tend to make, which I think is very worth elucidating in this conversation, is that corporate taxes are actually regressive. And this kind of, I think, really contradicts a lot of leftist common sense that people are used to, which is the idea that, well, you want to tax corporations because they make the most money. But no, the MMTers have been pointing out that actually has a negative effect on workers and the economy as a whole. So I want you to maybe lay out what you think is a better alternative tax proposal as it pertains to corporate tax, as well as income tax and real estate. Because if the government doesn't need money to fund, how high do income taxes really need to be? I think that's the big question.
Anyway, so income taxes have the highest compliance costs of anything in real terms. The number of people whose lives are tied up in income tax compliance is in the millions. Millions and millions of people are tax preparers. They're record keepers to all these companies that have to keep records for income taxes. There are lawyers who do tax law. There are people writing up income tax legislation and lobbyists, and people making millions of dollars a year doing this. And there are corporations setting up offshore tax things so they can minimize their income taxes. And individuals going to psychiatrists over problems with their income taxes. We've got all these related services that are tied up entirely on income tax, with these people, these probably 10 million people, maybe 20 million Americans, could be out curing cancer or teaching school or, doing useful work, some kind, working in public transportation. And that's kind of a free lunch, because right now we're wasting the time of those 20 million people. And they're all really smart people for the most part. JP Morgan hires really smart people to do tax compliance, okay? And to program all their computers to handle everybody's income tax records. So they're not hiring enough the bottom. These are brilliant people who could be doing who knows what. So anyway, and that's what our economy is good at, putting those people into, useful things based on, the market system. So you don't want the income tax. You don't want transaction taxes because of all the record keeping. All the sales taxes have all this record keeping. We want to eliminate all this work keeping records. And so the tax that has the lowest compliance cost, the lowest record keeping, is a property tax. You just put a tax on people's house and the land and everything.
The reason I connected that before to UBI and the job guarantee is because in one point I have seen in the MT literature is that the job guarantee is favorable to the universal basic income, partially because it can stabilize prices, whereas UBI has a risk of being inflationary, precisely because if you just give people a lot of money, what's to stop that from like being equalized by like companies just raising all the prices or price of rent too. The argument people make now is because people think like AI and automation will make it so that there's just simply not enough jobs for people to have a guarantee without creating BS jobs.
We've already been through that, and that's completely wrong. We had a situation a couple of 100 years ago where everybody had to be in agriculture. We'd all starve, right? And today we have like less than 1% of the people in agriculture. And, we produce like 8,000 calories a day per person and export food. And unemployment's, 4%. It's not 95% because of all this huge productivity gain. We used to have everybody in manufacturing, 50, 60%. Now it's like 7%. You're confusing a productivity story with an unemployment story. They're totally unrelated. Unemployment comes from the government, puts a tax in place, tax requirement, and then doesn't provide the money to pay the tax. Now you've got people unemployed. If they provide the people to pay the tax, you're not having unemployment. And of course, you have to provide money to pay the tax, and that's it. And that eliminates the unemployment created by the government. Taxation by design is meant to produce unemployment, people looking for paid work, so the government can hire them to provision itself. That's what it's for. The source of unemployment is taxation. Marx did not understand that. Right? And once you understand that basic money story, and you don't take action, you don't have tax requirements to cause people to need work, what's a tax credit worth without a tax? Nothing. The dollar's a tax credit. If there's no tax, you don't need a tax credit. It's worth nothing.
So the natural rate, the ideal rate of unemployment would be 0 in your view, rather than having a natural rate of, let's say, like 4% or whatever the central bank these days thinks it is.
Yeah. Now that all came again with fixed exchange rate policies where you had to do things to create unemployment, to reduce your real wealth because your output goes down in order to stabilize your foreign exchange reserves, whether they were gold or another currency. If you don't have that requirement, then stay with full employment and maximum output. Those are just consequences of having a fixed exchange rate. Those aren't consequences of floating exchange rate.
I want to ask your view on degrowth because there are some people in the degrowth movement in economics, some who seem to flirt with MMT, who believe that actually we need less stuff. So that's kind of where you'll have, in the sense that like you need people working less and you need, I guess, producing only what we need. That's their view. How do you view all that?
I think that's a legitimate position, very legitimate. If you look at our energy use today, it's probably more than double it was when I grew up in the 1950s as a kid. And we didn't laugh for anything. We had 2 cars per family and electric lights. But if you look at where most of our, I should say most because I don't have the data, enormous amount of our energy goes is to provide advertising on the internet. It's like, okay, how much of that do we really need? Now, when you look at degrowth, depends on how you define growth. I think people writing more songs and producing more theater is growth. I don't see why we should restrict that. Okay, but it would show up if, as GDP, if people were buying tickets and going to watch this stuff. So, I'd have to get down to how they're defining their terms and everything. But I think at the end of the day, we'd be on the same page on the degrowth, although I might call it rapid growth, but in areas that result in less energy consumption rather than more, that type of thing, that result in more leisure time rather than less. And one of the big drivers of that would be to replace the income tax with a property tax. That could free up, if you cut the work week by 25%, still have more stuff or goods and services if we wanted to do that as an option. Again, look at the real cost, the real compliance costs of all these things.
So would the ideal arrangement be that to have full employment and everybody working less, like in terms of hours?
We already have it. We have full employment with 40-hour weeks. We used to have full employment with 60-hour weeks. We've already done it. That's just a political decision. Our productivity is high enough to bring that down to 20 or 15-hour. if we got rid of the inefficiencies that I was talking.
So having a natural rate of unemployment, it's a political decision more than anything. And
Well, it's a political decision to have an exchange rate policy that requires it. Otherwise, there is no natural rate. The natural rate's zero on a floating exchange rate. It's positive on a fixed exchange rate where your object is to sustain foreign exchange reserves, which I don't know why anybody would want to do that, but they do.
so basically, the theory of the wage price spiral is not valid because some argue that the risk of a high, yeah, because I just want to clarify for the audience what that is. They think that basically, if you have full employment, what will happen is people will continue to ask for higher wages, which will lead to higher prices, which will lead to like inflation.
Right. But if it's driven by government wages, then it will happen. The government's just, when the government pays more for the same amount of work, it's redefining its currency lower. That's what we call inflation. And if you look around the world, many of your great inflations were driven by government indexation like that. Now, that doesn't make the country poorer or worse off or anything else. It doesn't change your wealth as a nation, but it does change the distribution of that wealth. It drives it towards people who are working for the government at the expense of others who are not.
I want to ask you about certain figures because the former Treasury Secretary was Christina Freeland, and she seemed to flirt with MMT a little bit at one point in her life, but has kind of distanced herself completely. And at least in terms of the policy she implements, it's more or less like stuff that's been done before, which is like higher interest rates. And now we have, as the new Liberal Party leader, who's likely to be the new Liberal Party leader anyway, is Mark Carney, who of course worked for the Bank of England and the Bank of Canada, very much a kind of guy with credibility in monetary policy. I want to ask you if you have any insight on these people, and if I don't, because you have met a lot of high-profile bankers behind the scenes, because people are concerned about the future of Canada, and the Conservative Party is offering the same kind of deficit reduction, balanced budgets, same old dogmas. So I kind of want to get your insights on some of this.
Those people have never spoken to me. Some of them may have spoken to other people about MMT, other proponents who maybe disagree with me on things. I'll just say have it wrong, just for toss that possibility out. And, they get out of the weeds. I've offered to speak with anybody. I'm here on the show, speak with anybody, but they just won't do it.
That is strange because we, with anything, need new ideas. Because I think the big obstacle is that even the Social Democrat Party in Canada, which is the New Democrats, they always feel that you need to tax to fund all of their programs that they want, like whether it be creating jobs, reducing homelessness, all of that. And as a result, Canadians don't really trust their solutions because they say, we're not going to tax the working majority or even the middle class. We're just going to raise taxes on the ultra rich. But people don't trust that because if you needed all that money to, quote unquote, fund these programs, they would also have to tax the working population too. So as a result, people don't trust their policy. So I think people really need to hear your insights are precisely those people.
Well, like my in-laws used to say, a lot of people in jail want to get out, need to get out. So, but I'm here. I'm 75 years old. I don't know how much longer I'm going to be around. I've got stage 4 prostate cancer. So if they want to know about it, they better hurry up and find me.
Indeed. Yeah. One of the last questions I wanted to ask you is about Trump's tariffs, because I kind of alluded to it before, but he floated the idea of abolishing the income tax and replacing with super high tariffs. And now he's already imposing high tariffs on everybody. In Canada, we've been hit by his tariffs. So I'm curious what you think about his tax policy and his tariff policy, because that's what's on everybody's mind right now.
Backed off on these tax policies over border arrangements. So clearly he wasn't serious about using them to raise money, or he would have left them on. He would have said, the tariffs are there because we need the money. And so I'm going to leave them on. But he didn't. He took them off. They're gone. So I don't know. You can't take him at his word, the same way you might somebody else.
I more mean, like, what do you think of the actual idea itself? Like, assuming he was serious to follow through.
Look, I've got this book, The 7 Deadly Innocent Frauds. Maybe you've read that one. Takes about an hour, and it's free online. Mosler economics.com. And chapter 5 is about trade, and he's got it completely backwards. We should be holding a ticker tape parade, on Fifth Avenue for China for having supported our standard of living for the last 20, 30 years, sending us free things and not wanting anything in return except the bank statement saying that they did it. And, without them, we wouldn't have our standard of living. It would be substantially lower. And instead, he's trying to end it, kill the goose that's laying the golden egg. And they're fighting it. They want to keep doing it. The whole thing's absurd, but that's what's going on. And it's real. And it's the same people who can make a cell phone can't understand something as simple as that. What are we punishing Canada for? Not charging us enough for lumber. What kind of crime is that? We should be rewarding you for that. Giving you some kind of special tourism rights when you come to the United States, thanking you for selling us things at low prices. That's a good thing for us. We don't. President Trump put tariffs on Canada because you weren't charging us enough. And then President Biden, doubled down, added to the tariffs because you still weren't charging us enough. These people it's madness, and I don't know what else to tell you. It's chapter 5 in the book outlines it very clearly, and it could be simpler. In economics is the opposite of religion. It's better to receive than to give, And I guess it's too hard for them. I'd never send one of them to go shopping for me, that's for sure. They'll come back from the grocery store saying, I'm not going to that store again. They weren't charging enough. Go to another store. It's who are these people? They've never gone shopping. I don't know.
Well, I guess the last question is, and this is kind of, because this is just a point of confusion, is that given all of this, what is very perplexing to me, and probably a lot of people listening to this, is, we've talked about why various taxes are kind of unnecessary and too high, but especially corporate taxes. If you take a Marxist understanding of ruling class and the ruling ideas, why would governments that are supposed to reflect the interest of the dominant capitalist property owning class, why would they even keep high corporate taxes? Because the Republicans still keep corporate taxes. They lower them, but they still keep them. I find it interesting, though, China has very low corporate taxes. So
they're not working in their own best interest. That's why I call it innocent fraud. You don't know whether it's innocence or fraud. Innocence is more damning because you're saying that it's too hard for it. They can't figure this out.
Yeah, that's perplexing. And almost hard to believe. That's the kind of the thing. I think that's the part that
I agree. Especially in our age of technical understanding.
So it's like a Copernican revolution sort of thing where it really is an understanding problem.
Well, that was before I was born, so I can't speak to that.
Anyway, thank you for being here. I don't want to eat up too much of your time, but I hope this has been helpful for people who want to learn more about this. But I would highly suggest Warren Mosler's work because it's short. It's quite, I wouldn't say it's easy to understand, but it's very easy to read because it's not very long. 7 Innocent Frauds is, I think, 40-something pages. Then Soft Currency Economics is less than 100.
Yeah, maybe 10 or 15.
Yeah. So I'd recommend checking those out. And thank you for being here.
Okay. Take care. Thanks.
My only hope is that when enough people become pessimist, then out of despair somebody maybe does something. But you know why I also like to be a pessimist? Because it's the only way to have a nice life. If you're an optimist, then always bad things happen and you are always disappointed. When you are a pessimist, then you look around, okay, there are bad, but from time to time something nice happens and you are, as a pessimist, you are a little bit glad all the time, no?
You are listening to One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra content.